you have an MRI and it shows lesions. Let those lesions get typical. And then spinal tap is also great. Do you get lesions associated with
I'm going to defer to Dr. Bateman. I'm a scientist, okay? I'm not somebody who can lay hands on you. And I'm also not an expert interpreting images. I do know that that there are still problems with MRI and MS, okay? There are perfectly fine brain images, and people still have MS. There are also, the other end of the spectrum, really messed up images, and people don't have MS. So I think what MRI did was give us an objective way of identifying MS, but that's not without its true and false positives, okay?
Is XMRP going to be one of those biomarkers?
We'll get to that. Okay, so this is a complicated model of CFS that's been developed over the years, or has actually been kind of compiled because of all of the information that we've accumulated over the years that is complicated, okay? But it does paint a picture, again, a model of the overall understanding, our overall understanding of CFS. We know that there are a number of interactions between the brain and the body and the blood, and these are signaling things that that really result in many of the symptoms of CFS and fibromyalgia. So this is a communication breakdown, okay? We also have identified in the literature a number of different risk factors. What's a risk factor? It's something that increases the possibility that you might get sick with CFS or fibromyalgia. We know that those risk factors are both genetic and environmental. What do I mean by environmental? I mean infection. I mean chemical exposure. I mean the types of animals that you have in your house, the type of food that you can consume. A number of these things have been determined to increase your risk of developing CFS or fibromyalgia. In combination, that's an important point, in combination with your genetic background, your blueprint. Neither one is necessary or sufficient. Okay? They have to work together in order to be able to end up in a disease state. And these are risk factors. They're something that contribute to your development of disease. We also know that the brain, as our body's command and control center, is really what is responsible for many of the symptoms that we experience in CFS and fibromyalgia. Okay? So these symptoms of pain and fatigue and cognitive impairment and what are my other symptoms? Sleep dysfunction. Yes, importantly, sleep dysfunction. These are all mediated by the brain. Okay? Again, just think of the brain as our command and control center. The signaling, the commands from the brain then affect all of our body systems. What goes on in our gut, whether or not we have pain in our joints, whether or not our heart is able to pump blood properly throughout our body. Just because these things are below the neck doesn't mean that they're not talking to the brain. This is a highly integrated system that, the head can't function without the body and vice versa. So just think of it as a very intricate circuitry that is important to be kept in balance. When any one of these things is off balance, we have an unhealthy or unbalanced system or a disease state. Many of these areas in this picture can serve and do serve as biomarkers. So we know about NK cell dysfunction. That's one of the blood cells that's important in fighting off viruses. We know, and Dr. Klimas and Marianne Fletcher almost 20 years ago showed that this particular cell was not functioning the right way in people with CFS, which would have implications for how a person with CFS actually handles virus infection. We also know that there is evidence of RNase L dysfunction. This is an enzyme in the immune cells that's also important for activating the way that NK cell is able to handle the virus. Okay? Again, not everyone has found these dysfunctions, but in general, it makes sense. Some people have found them, others have not. We also know, and this is a lot of my work, that gene expression, the genes that are expressed in the immune cells, are very different than in people with CFS and in fibromyalgia than in people that do not have either of these. The pattern of expression in the immune cells seems to indicate that there's this low level of inflammation going on in people with CFS. How many of you know what inflammation is? Okay, many of you. So when you get the flu, the way your body responds is to turn on your immune system so that you're all of a sudden cranking out, pumping out all these kinds of inflammatory molecules that go work to fight the agent or whatever it is, the nasty virus that's causing your illness at that time. Once the immune system has taken care of the infection, an anti-inflammatory response kicks in. It dampens down the pro-inflammatory response, so now your body's back to balance. You're no longer inflamed. So you can imagine when a body has to live in a chronically inflamed state, that you also feel chronically like you have the flu. Okay? This is not rip-roaring pro-inflammatory molecules. It's very subtle, but we're finding now that even these low-level subtle differences are important. We also know that there are potential brain biomarkers, both at a brain metabolism level and also a functional level. And I think Dr. Wood showed this morning that there are some differences in the front part of the brain, which is our higher executive functions, helping us think, helping us concentrate. Those have been shown in small studies, imaging studies and functional MRI studies, and are important to repeat and show, demonstrate these types of differences in larger studies. Almost everybody with chronic fatigue syndrome, 75–80% of the population has significant autonomic nervous system dysfunction. These are blood flow differences, difficulties in making the blood flow, pump up to the brain, and it looks like, rather than this being some type of defect with the heart, that it's actually some type of chemical signaling that's going wrong, that's not allowing our vessels to open and constrict properly so that the blood is staying down in our feet or down below our belly button, rather than being able to pump up to the brain in a fashion that allows me to be standing up here talking to you without going flat. We also know that there's cortisol problems, and this is an endocrine problem, a hormone that's produced by the adrenal gland that then works to talk to the brain, not only to talk to the brain to say, everything's okay, I'm calm, cool, I don't have to fight or I don't have to run, Cortisol is an important molecule in the fight or flight system, but it's also a molecule that regulates our immune response. We know that in a subset of people with CFS, that cortisol is low.
Why would cortisol go? Instead of higher? I'm just trying to figure it out. Why is it low?
We do know that there are some genetic differences, some genetic polymorphisms in the glucocorticoid receptor. So the glucocorticoid receptor is the receptor of cortisol. And the way cortisol works is it comes into a cell, and the cell that's been studied most is the immune cell, as far as the cortisol, glucocorticoid, or cortisol receptor complex has been studied. So what could be the problem is a rate-limiting problem. So it's not necessarily a low level of cortisol, but the way the cortisol enters the cell and then results in its own regulation of production, its own signaling. It's probably more of a signaling problem than it is a production problem. But that's a guess. We also have a number of potential infectious agents as biomarkers for CFS. And I was in Japan back in June, and the Japanese actually use a lot of these agents as biomarkers. They measure them, they see whether or not they're high, they're low, and they correlate this, or they associate this with how severe someone is, or whether or not they have a certain level of pain, or whether or not they have a certain level of cognitive impairment. So some people, some countries are already using some of these agents as biomarkers, and they use that to also direct certain types of interventions and treatments. And then we have the possibility, as you just pointed out, of using genetics and genomics as biomarkers. So there's a lot of potential that we have. But why haven't many of these biomarkers, all the ones that I just spent 15 minutes blabbing about, why aren't they at your disposal? Why don't we have pharma producing tests or having treatments that are directed to help get these biomarkers back in check? I think it's because we're dealing with a very mixed batch of disease. CFS, fibromyalgia, I heard this morning, we've studied it extensively, is not just one thing. It's might all be fruit, like this fruit basket shows, but your fruit is not like your fruit. Or your orange, you might be a navel and you might be a tangerine, okay? There's subtle differences, and there's also pretty dramatic differences, all underneath this umbrella.